All right. Well, thank you very much for coming. I'm Richard Prum, Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and Director of the Franke Program in Science and Humanities. Welcome to today's event. As always, I'm interested in thanking the Frankes for their ongoing support and also to the Whitney for making this possible. Today's speaker is Carl Craver, who is a distinguished historian and philosopher of science, particularly of neuroscience. He studied history and philosophy of science at the University of Pittsburgh, and he teaches at Washington University, where he is a full professor in the Department of Philosophy and in the program in Philosophy, Neuroscience, and Psychology. Craver is the author of dozens of peer-reviewed articles and 2 books on philosophy of neuroscience, and his work focuses particularly on clarifying the nature of explanation in neuroscience, a critique of reductionist law-like accounts of causal explanation, and the support of alternative accounts of explanation that focus on mechanistic or mechanism at multiple levels. His work is notable for sophistication of engagement both with philosophy and with ongoing empirical programs in neuroscience. So today, Carl will be talking to us about new work on the phenomenon of episodic amnesia, what these maladies reveal about the complexity of time perception, and how these complexities, or what implications these complexities may have for uses of the concept of time perception in neuroscience today. Carl will also be speaking tomorrow as well at the Enlian Center at the medical school at 4:15, where he'll be talking on graphing the brain's dark energy, network models, and neural mechanism. And please join me in welcoming Carl.
Thank you very much for coming out today. It's cold out there, and I appreciate you being here. The talk that I'm going to give today is somewhat distant from my traditional interests in the philosophy of science. Normally I work on the nature of scientific explanation, but for the past 3 or 4 years, I've found myself engaged in a research project with some collaborators of mine spread hither and yon. In fact, I'll begin by thanking them just so that I don't forget at the end. Looking at a particular construct in psychology, the construct of episodic memory, the ability, as it's roughly defined, to remember events from your past experiences, to remember past experiences from your life. And this has been an interest of mine since I was an undergraduate when I wrote my honors thesis on Locke's theory of personal identity, which ties the identity of the person over time very strongly to continuity of consciousness and connections, memorial connections between one slice of a person and another slice of a person. That's not my interest today. I got into this topic in part because I was interested in what episodic memory is and what it does for us as people. I'll say more about that in just a second. But before I get into the details of this, I should just begin by thanking the people who've been working with me on this. Donna Kwan, pictured up in the upper left-hand corner here, collected much of the data that I'll be talking about. Shana Rosenbaum is my collaborator and her advisor. Stan Klein at the University of California, Santa Barbara, shared some patient data with me. Farine Varga-Kadam provided some details about some amnesics that I'll be talking about along the way, developmental amnesics in particular. Chloe Steinem and Ben Graham are were undergraduate students of mine at Washington University in St. Louis. Chloe is now at UCSB, and Ben is here in the law school somewhere. Len Green and Joel Meyerson are the people that I've worked with on the decision-making aspect of this talk. And really what I'm interested in is a question that's been with me since my earliest training in philosophy, which is what I think is the most puzzling question that philosophers really have to address at the moment, which is to relate the fact that we have 2 very different ways of thinking about human beings. On the one hand, we think about one another as the kind of things that have beliefs and draw inferences and make decisions and can be held responsible for their actions, the kinds of things that we talk about paradigmatically as moral agents and reasoners. And then on the other hand, we have a view of the human organism that comes to us from the sciences like cognitive science and neuroscience, where really human beings, properly understood, are a set of dissociable capacities implemented in mechanisms throughout the brain and the rest of the body. And it's very difficult to see somebody at once as both the kind of thing that counts as a reasoner and agent responsible for their actions, and to see them as their behavior as the product of these sorts of machines. And this talk today is really about trying to put those two perspectives together. And part of the way that I think that we could move towards a synoptic vision of these two views of the human organism is to ask both a conceptual question and an empirical question. When we say that we come at the human organism from these two perspectives, on the one hand, we have to ask the question, what must a human being be able to do in order to deserve this status of being an agent or a reasoner or the kind of thing that could be held responsible for its actions? What sorts of capacities must they be able to perform? Must they be able to construct counterfactuals, for example, or orient themselves in time, or figure out the consequences of their actions, or attribute values to the consequences of their actions? These are the kinds of things that we would normally assess when we're deciding whether somebody was responsible for their criminal activity, for example. But then there's also just an empirical question: can people with different kinds of cognitive deficits do those things? And I think we have to answer both of those questions if we hope to form any sort of synoptic image here. And part of this will involve bringing the empirical vocabulary to bear on what's a philosophical vocabulary, and they were not made to match one another particularly well. The kind of approach that I've taken to all of this with my collaborators is what we might call a moral neuropsychology. In these cases, I take it to be something like the study of how specific cognitive deficits, for example, different forms of amnesia, alter one's status as an agent. It's common in articles about people with episodic amnesia that they're described in somewhat infantilized terms, that they're no longer responsible for the decisions that they make. When we do experiments with them, we don't only ask them for their consent, though we do ask them for their consent. We also ask their parents to consent on their behalf. We don't think of them as able to make those kind of decisions. If they're signing a contract or entering into an agreement or getting married, as some of them in fact do, we wonder whether somebody who's got this kind of cognitive deficit is the kind of thing that can properly be said to have what it takes to enter into those kinds of agreements. So when I talk about people in the space of reasons, it's that broad panoply of things that I'm thinking of. But on the part B, I'm thinking, is the study of how different cognitive capacities enable human beings to deserve that status. Now, one famous philosopher who played a big role in training me, John McDowell, is famous in saying that these two things have nothing to do with one another. There's one language that we've got for describing people in our everyday interactions with one another. There's another language that we use when we investigate the brain or the mind scientifically, and those two languages do not match up with one another and should not be expected to. They were formed for two entirely different sorts of purposes. On the one hand, for regulating our social commerce with one another, and on the other hand, for doing an empirical investigation into the underlying mechanisms. McDowell, in his one bit of nodding in the direction of neuroscience, says, well, of course, the brain of an agent can't be a homogeneous jelly. It's got to have some sort of structure to it. I would say that's exactly right, and really that's the only kind of premise that I need to get into this argument. We can look at how the brain is not a homogeneous jelly, the parts that it might break into, and how they contribute to this sort of status. My method is going to be a simple one. It's the one that's the mainstay of cognitive neuropsychology, and it's a method of dissociations. And in this method, you find a person who has lost the capacity to do one thing, A, while maintaining the capacity to do some other thing, B. And what you're licensed to infer from such a patient is that you don't need A for B. A is unnecessary for B. And you might also call this a kind of causal independence. If I learn that you can lose your episodic memory, for example, I'll define that in just a second, and maintain your semantic or procedural learning, that suggests that episodic memory is causally independent of these others, at least to the extent that you don't need to have episodic memory in order to learn semantic facts or to learn procedures. I should be clear when I talk about episodic memory, though, that I'm not always entirely clear whether I'm merely talking about a behavioral capacity, the kind of thing that we display when we tell one another stories about what happened to us in the past, the kinds of things that we display when we answer questions, cues to tell you about our favorite birthday party or something like that. Or looking inside to a kind of cognitive capacity that we idealize inside of ourselves, a dedicated mechanism of some sort that's responsible just for that and for nothing else. I'll be moving back and forth between these two, but I think everything that I want to say today could be understood if we only think of these as behavioral capacities in some way. One premise of what I'm doing is that episodic memory can be selectively damaged, leaving many aspects of our mental lives intact. And the form of inference here is that episodic memory isn't necessary for those other aspects of our mental lives. These things are pretty shocking, and I almost didn't believe it until I met some people who had these forms of amnesia. You can have somebody with who's very high functioning and able to have an incredibly intelligent conversation with you in the moment, but they won't remember that conversation 5 minutes later if you distract them with a cup of coffee. And when you see that for the first time, it's very shocking, but it is possible to preserve these other capacities while losing episodic memory. The one thing that I'll say as a methodological rule for myself is that I try to confine myself to negative claims about dissociations. If an individual who has episodic amnesia, has lost their episodic memory, succeeds on a task, then we're within our rights to conclude that having episodic memory is not required for you to succeed on that task. You've demonstrated it. Right? But if the individual with episodic amnesia fails on a task, then one cannot infer that episodic memory is necessary for success on that task because they might have damage to other parts of the brain that we're not aware of. They might have other cognitive deficits that we haven't picked up on. But the negatives, it seemed to me, constrain the positives here. And if we're going to tell any meaningful story about the role that episodic memory plays in our lives as persons, we have to first rule out some plausible thoughts that we might have from our folk conception of episodic memory to build a more plausible story. And why am I interested in episodic memory in particular? Well, I've already mentioned this John Locke character who seemed to tie quite a bit of our forensic notion of the person to our ability to bind the moments of our lives together through memorial linkages. But it's also the case that if you read a bunch of cognitive science, you'll find that it's often claimed that this is a uniquely human capacity, that the capacity to reflect on our past experiences and relive, and as it were, relive them, is something that isn't shared even by chimpanzees. Or bonobos. Although there are some claims that you can find it in elephants or in different forms of corvids, there are also a large number of scientists that claim that it's never in fact been demonstrated in non-human organisms. And furthermore, I think there's just a folk plausibility to the idea that episodic memory is something that plays a role in our lives as people. When we're terrified about the possibility that we might acquire Alzheimer's disease into the future, one of the things that people often express concern about is that they might forget their lives, and that having forgotten their lives, they've lost pretty much everything that they have to lose. We also, when we think about children, it seems that this capacity for episodic memory, it's often claimed, doesn't really fully become present in young children until they're the ages around 3, 4, 5 years old, depending on different people's estimates. And we often think that children beneath that age are not really to be punished with anger, but rather molded in various ways, not held responsible for the things that they do, but we find teachable moments instead, right? But once they get this ability to keep track of what they're doing and why, we start holding them responsible. So I think there's a kind of surface plausibility to the thought that this capacity to remember experiences from our lives is really important to how we think about people quite generally. And I also want to look at this today in particular with respect to time and the sense that people with episodic amnesia have about time. The dominant metaphor that cognitive neuropsychologists use to describe people with episodic memory is that they're trapped in a permanent present, an eternal now. Right? So here are just some representative quotes. Roberts in 2002 asked the question, do animals have a sense of time, episodic memory, and an ability to cognitively project activities into the future? Or are animals permanently similar to KC? KC is one of the subjects that I'll be talking about in just a second. And to children under the age of 4, notice the infantilization, KC and children under the age of 4 and rats. Could animals be largely stuck in a permanent present with little ability to remember past episodes or plan activities for the future? Delabarba and Lacourt last year say, 2 years ago, however, amnesic patients not only do not consciously remember their past, but also they cannot imagine their personal future and are severely disoriented in their present world. In light of these observations, amnesia from hippocampal damage, as well as confabulation, cannot be considered pure episodic memory deficits, but rather pathological conditions affecting the individual's entire subjective temporality, the very idea that you exist in time. Endel Tulving, when he introduced the concept of episodic memory in 1983 on the first actually one of the last pages of the book, says, "We can, if we wish, close our eyes and think about what we did 10 minutes ago or how we celebrated our last birthday, and we can think about what we might be doing tomorrow or next year. This kind of sense of time makes a huge difference to what we are and how we live. If we retained our other mental capacities but lost the awareness of time in which our lives are played out, we might still be uniquely different from all other animals, but we would no longer be human as we understand it." It's a very strong claim about the role of episodic memory in our lives as persons. And understanding time, arguably, is central to many of our agential capacities. If you don't know that there's a future, how do you think about the future consequences of your actions? If you can't remember what you've done, in what sense can you be punished justly for that thing? And of course, this metaphor gets repeated time and time again. Sue Corkin, in her book, recently wrote a book about the famous patient HM, who after bilateral surgical removal of the hippocampus lost the ability to lay down any new memories. The title of the book is Permanent Present Tense. The movie Memento is edited in reverse order in order to give us a sense of the temporal disorientation that somebody with episodic amnesia must experience in their lives. And many of you have probably seen the footage that's available on YouTube and elsewhere on the internet of Clive Waring, one of the most famous amnesic subjects, who begins each day by opening up his journal and writing down, it seems, what is the exact phrasing? "Now I am fully awake for the first time." And then he scratches it out and writes under it, "Now I am fully awake for the first time," scratches it out. "Now I am fully awake." And this kind of evidence gives us the sense of somebody who really is trapped in the present and in some ways just stimulus bound. The only thing that they have to deal with is what's in front of them. And that kind of truncated outlook on the world would severely hamper somebody as an agent. All right, that's all just by way of introduction to the topic that I'm going to get into. And my claim is really that people with episodic amnesia are in no sense stuck in time. And that these claims have merely grabbed hold of the minds of the cognitive scientists and have become elaborated over time into a fairly complicated story that in fact has never been tested. And I'll talk to you about some evidence that we've done to really suss out what's left of the amnesic sense of time in amnesia. And I think what this really does for us is to help us to back away from our ordinary conception of what memory is or what episodic memory is, and to start thinking about it in much more specific terms, the terms of a much more mature science, about what's actually going on in these people who have this thing that we use the term episodic amnesia to describe. So I'll begin first just by talking about one person who will be the center of my discussion. His name is Kent Cochran. He died last year. He had the most severe and well-documented case of episodic memory of anyone in the world. Then I'm going to go through different ways of thinking about time and how we might assay the sense of time in a person of this sort. I'll talk about knowledge of what James McTaggart called the A series and the B series. I'll explain those in just a second. I'll talk about Zimbardo's work on temporal perspectives and attitudes about the past and the future. I'll talk about the impulsivity and risk-taking behavior of people with episodic amnesia. I'll talk about the extent to which they're able to attribute value to future situations, and I'll talk about their capacity to anticipate regret. And the reason I'm interested in all of those things is because those are the things that we take to be relevant for whether somebody is in fact a full-fledged agent, whether it's proper to speak of them in infantilized terms, whether it's proper to deny them the right to give their own consent or to enter into an engagement with another human being. If there's a main thesis here, besides the individual points that get made along the way, it's that the human sense of time, like memory, is cognitively complex and isn't a unitary thing at all. and much of it is in fact preserved in people with episodic amnesia. Individuals with episodic amnesia, I'm willing to say with complete certainty at this point, are not stuck in time, are not trapped in a permanent present. This is an illegitimate extension of a metaphor that's gotten out of control. The hippocampus in the MTL system is not, as many people say, a time machine. All right, this is a picture of Kent and his family. Kent's on the right. His mother is sitting down in the front, father behind, brother who has just been married, and the other brother who functioned as the best man in the wedding. If you show KC this picture, KC was in an automobile accident 30-some years ago and had very severe forms of brain damage, which I'll mention in just a second. But if you show him this picture, he'll look at it and he can name all of the people in the picture, and he can say that it was probably a wedding, probably his brother's wedding. But then he notices himself and he says, but what's going on with my hair? And it turns out that the night before his brother's wedding, KC decided to give himself a permanent and show up for the wedding with this new do to share with his entire family. He has no memory of having done this. He has no memory of being evacuated from his house when the train wrecked in the backyard, spilling toxic chemicals. He doesn't remember being on the boat when his brother fell off the side and was killed. He doesn't remember, that is, even very salient events from his life. And the harder you push on him, the worse he seems to get. The way he's been characterized in the literature is having a complete anterograde and retrograde episodic amnesia. That is, he has no episodic memories from his entire life. And never did until he died. He also has an anterograde semantic deficit, meaning that he has extreme difficulty acquiring new semantic knowledge about the world. And he has extensive cortical atrophy, which is why we have to be very cautious about the inferences that we make here. This is a terrible case for localizing function in the brain. It's a terrible case for drawing direct connections between brain structures and cognitive functions. He has bilateral medial temporal lobe volume loss with damage to the hippocampus and the parahippocampal cortex, and much more besides. Some septal damage, some damage to the thalamus on one side. And there's a complete description of that in Shana Rosenbaum's article. What she does characterize is a whole set of batteries of different tests that have been done on KC over the years to characterize the pattern of deficits and the pattern of preserved performance. And it's really quite striking on all of them. You see an extreme deficit in memory-related tasks, episodic memory-related tasks, and almost no deficit in the other columns. Consideration of this case is what led Endel-Talving to introduce the concept of episodic memory, or was one of the things that really solidified it in his mind, which he defined in many different ways over time. But roughly, he thinks of them as memories of past experiences, of personal events, accompanied by awareness of one's previously having experienced that event. This, he says, is what he calls autonoetic consciousness, awareness that you previously experienced the event. And he also calls this a kind of mental time travel, the ability to imagine yourself in different times and places, so to take yourself from the here and now and to move yourself to some time in the past. And when he characterizes these, he describes them, it's important for him to distinguish episodic from semantic memory. So episodic memories tend to be about a personal past. I remember riding this roller coaster, The Voyage, with my daughter a few summers ago. It tends to be experiential. I can still conjure up the anxiety that I felt coming down the first hill. It tends to be emotive, coupled to emotions. It tends to be temporally and spatially organized, so I remember coming over the top and going over a series of bumps and then banking to the right at 90 degrees, flying around a circle, and I can put that all together in a sequence from beginning to end. I'll leave out the I remember flying bit. Well, I won't. Philosophers will distinguish a particular way of expressing these thoughts. If I say, like, I remember riding the roller coaster. And in these, when I say it in this form, the flying is always something that happened in the past. All right? Semantic memories, in contrast, tend to be factual memories. They can be located in the past, the present, or the future. I can remember that Columbus is in Ohio. I can remember that, that yesterday was, what day was yesterday? Tuesday. I can remember that, usually I can remember that yesterday was Tuesday. And I can remember that tomorrow I have an appointment to meet with Bob and talk about neuroimaging. And those can be in the past, the present, or the future. They tend to be propositional in nature, not experiential in quality. They tend to be cold. Columbus is in Ohio. I don't have to have any feelings about that or thoughts about it besides just Columbus is in Ohio. And they tend to be conceptually organized, as I'm bringing out. And we say, I remember that psi, rather than just I remember phi-ing. I remember that psi, and psi is something that could be in the past, the present, or the future. This is just a gist to get you thinking about the right sort of cognitive construct that I'm trying to get across to you. But the idea is that there's a sort of reliving experience, a mental time travel to the past. It's that language of mental time travel that really captures the imagination and allows us to transport this concept to new places where it wasn't before, I think. The other thing that allows us to do that is the fact that these people who have damage to systems that are involved in episodic memory are not just unable to remember things about the past. If you ask them to imagine vividly what's going on in their personal futures, they're unable to do that as well. Randy Buckner has at one point claimed that this might just be a perspective-taking system generally, that it might be involved in remembering the picnic that you had, or imagining the future in which you're helping to put away the dishes, or taking the perspective of the person who's wondering why you're not helping to put away the dishes, or taking the perspective of a different spatial location. And the suggestion was not just that this was an episodic memory system, but now it was a general perspective-taking system that involved imagining yourself in different times and places, quite generally, or in other people's minds. That latter one turns out to be false. My collaborator, Shana Rosenbaum, has shown that people with episodic amnesia understand sarcasm, they read facial expressions, they can understand stories and understand the motivations of the actors in the stories. So the idea that somehow they're unable to put themselves into the minds of other people turns out to be false. But these other three are live options. If you ask why it is that we came to think that episodic amnesia was associated with deficits in future thought as well as thinking in the past, it really comes down to one conversation that's reprinted in almost every article that I read on this topic. It's between Endel Talding and KC. Endel asked, let's try the question again about the future. What will you be doing tomorrow? There's a 15-second pause, and he says, I don't know. Do you remember the question about what I'll be doing tomorrow? Yeah. How would you describe your state of mind when you try to think about it? Another 5-second pause. He says, blank, I guess. If you ask him again, he'll say it's like being asleep, or it's a big blankness sort of thing. Or it's like being in a room and there's nothing there and having a guy tell you to go find a chair and there's nothing there. Or it's like swimming in the middle of a lake and there's nothing there to hold you up with. These are the kinds of things that he says when he's asked both to think about the future and to think about the past. Oliver Sacks, in his book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, describes the Jimmy G, the Lost Mariner, as adrift on a sea of time, in part because he doesn't have the ability to imagine himself in the past and the future. So this conversation led people to, plus this characterization of mental time travel, led people to assume that somebody who had these kinds of deficits must really be trapped in the here and now and not have any sense of their own personal future. If that's true, then their status as moral agents, their status as persons in the ordinary sense of the word, the kind of thing that you would make plans with or rely upon, goes out the window. But is it true? Well, the first thing that we wanted to ask was just whether they had an understanding of the semantics of time. And to do this, we made use, and there's a philosopher, Christoph Hoerl, in 1998, wrote an article in which he claimed that if you didn't have episodic memory, you wouldn't have any sense of the difference between past, present, or future, because you wouldn't have any experience to draw on in making that sort of judgment. To get at this question, we used an old philosopher, McTaggart, who draws a distinction between two ways of conceptualizing time. On the one hand, we conceptualize time as being divided into basically three compartments. One in the future, one in the present, and one in the past. And we might in fact see the present as a sliding window that reveals more and more of the future and leaves more and more in the past. On the other hand, we might think of time more as in the way that a physicist might. The time is just a sequence of events that are arranged as earlier or later than one another. And this idea that there's a now moving through it all is merely a psychological construct, or at least that's how many people have argued. But we wanted to know whether it would be possible for them to have semantic knowledge of what the past, present, and future are, the idea that there's a direction to time, that there's a causal asymmetry of the past and the future, so that the past can cause the future and the future can't cause the past. And we also just wanted to know whether they could take a bunch of events and order them in time, sequentially. So the first test was really about the B series. This is just a series of events ordered as earlier or later, like a timeline that you would find in a history book. So we took a bunch of events from Casey's life, none of which he remembers in any episodic detail whatsoever, but we put them all on a sheet in front of him and then asked him to arrange them on a timeline. It turns out that he gets the bulk of the 20 items exactly right. He gets 6 of them wrong. One that he gets wrong, he wasn't involved in. It was the Toronto Expo in 1967. 3 of the ones that he gets wrong are accidents in which he lost consciousness. So here is his motorcycle accident in which he suffered a concussion and lost consciousness. Here is where he wrecks his VW Bug, and this is when he was hit on the head with a bale of hay. He doesn't get those right, but all of these other events are in fact put in the proper order relative to the current time. But that doesn't tell us, of course, whether he has any concept of times changing. It just means that he can order these events in his life. So we decided to just ask him. I said, what's the future? And he says, oh, there are events that haven't happened yet, reasonably enough. What's the past? There are events that have already happened. Can you change the past? They're now trying to get at causation. No. Can you change the future? Yeah. How? By doing different things. Does what happened in the past influence what happens in the future? Yes. He's not a very loquacious guy, Casey. He's pretty quiet. And you'll see that some of the other people that we'll interview later go on at great length, and they're rather delighted in answering these questions and thinking about them. Does what you do now influence what happens in the future? I guess so. Does what you do now change what has happened in the past? No. Can something that happens in the future change what happened in the past? No. If an event is in the future, will it always be in the future? He says no. Why? Because time moves on. Once an event is in the past, will it always be in the past? He says yes. We ask him if he could go back and undo a murder that he's done. He says that you could not. We ask him if he's ever read about time travel and if he can say what it is. And he says, well, it's to take a body and move it to a previous era. This finding has now been replicated actually it's now 6 other cases of people with extreme episodic amnesia, and they're all able to answer these semantic questions. I don't think this is a big deal. It's just it shows that either episodic memory is unnecessary for one to have knowledge of the A series, or that these people that I've been looking at, like KC, DA, and DB, acquired semantic knowledge of the A series before their brain damage. That's all we can really conclude in these cases. But then we can look at people who've had developmental forms of episodic amnesia. So they've never really formed an episodic memory in their life. They had some anoxic event at childbirth that did damage to the hippocampus. And so they've had at least extremely truncated forms of episodic memory their entire life. Here I'm thinking about John, who's in London, and HC, who's in Toronto. I won't read all of these answers to you, but just to give you a sense of how they go, first there are a bunch of questions about just the semantics of these things and whether they can remember stuff. We ask, could you give an example of something that happened in the past? And HC says, well, in general, man walked on the moon. And personally, she says, I went snorkeling with my sister and my mom. Asking John about it, he notes that the Queen's Jubilee is something that happened in the past, and asked if he attended it. He said yes, but then asked where he was standing when he watched the flotilla go by. He was unable to locate himself along the Thames anywhere. And I have it on authority from people who live in London, that if you live in London, you know where you were on the Thames and which bridge you were standing by. Thinking about the direction of time, things get maybe a little bit more interesting. We ask, if an event is in the future, will it always be in the future, and why? And John says, well, no, because it's got a date to happen, and eventually that time will come, and it will be in the present and then in the past. HC says, when asked, once an event is in the past, will it always stay in the past? She says, yes, it's already happened. It can only happen once, and if it happens more than once, it's a different event. Not a bad thought. Even, I would expect that's about what I would expect from an advanced undergraduate in a philosophy course on time, I think. When we ask about the causal order of things, can you change the past? Here John gets really quite animated. Can you change the past? Well, he says, well, it is possible. It is possible to change the past. Well, how? Well, by going back in time. But only if you can travel fast enough. And at the moment, we can't. So the answer is no, we can't change the past. But yes. There's some confusion here, but clearly he's bringing some elementary thoughts about physics into the picture. Then we ask him, can you change the future? And if so, how? And this sends him into quite a spin. He says, well, change the future only if you think certain things are going to happen in your life and they don't. Just because different events happen. That's kind of changing the future, but it's not, so the answer is still no. Like, you can't change the past, because although you can try to change the future, like you see in films and things, people try and change the future per se, but by their very actions, they do something different. They change the future anyway. So yes, you can change the future, but in a way the answer is still no, and it goes on and on and on and on. He's having a Star Trek moment, where he's thinking through various thought experiments about changing the future, and it's not a perplexity about the nature of time, but rather it's a deep perplexity about the nature of time, not a surface perplexity about the nature of time. He gets what we're asking him, and he tries to answer that question, and he tries to do it in a fairly sophisticated way. And these are both people who've never had have had an episodic memory deficit from the time that they were born. So I think all we can conclude on the basis of this is that either episodic memory is unnecessary to acquire conceptual knowledge of the A series, which is plausible enough, or individuals with developmental amnesias build conceptual knowledge of the A series from what few episodic memories they manage to retain. One thing to think here is that knowledge of the A series is semantic knowledge, and people with developmental amnesia are capable of acquiring semantic knowledge of different sorts. Some of them are graduating from high school, and one of them is, HC, is about to become a professional cook. And if you think there's an experiential component, it's not exactly clear why working memory wouldn't suffice rather than episodic memory. All right, that's in a way the low-hanging fruit and the easy stuff to test. Suppose you think about temporal attitudes. You might know that there's a past, a present, and a future, and know why they're distinct from one another, but not care. That it doesn't matter to you whether something occurs in the past or in the future. If you ask somebody, would you accept, if you were going to get a painful experience, would you rather it be in your past or in your future? You might expect them to be 50-50 on that. Actually, we should do that. We'd never asked them that one. But the prediction might be that episodic amnesics will exhibit a myopic focus on the present with little concern for their past and their future. If they're trapped in the present, and if that metaphor is accurate, that might be what you expect. You might expect them to be what Zimbardo calls present hedonists. These are Yale undergraduates, I think. These are people oriented towards the hedonistic present, self-indulgent pleasure seekers that shirk all exacting work. Zimbardo 2003. Or alternatively, they might be fatalistic. That is, if they can't imagine a future, and remember, they've been living with KC lived with his parents for the last 30 years of his life. And you might think that if you have episodic amnesia and you can't imagine a future or remember anything that you've done, you might start thinking that nothing that you do really matters all that much. So I'm not crazy about this test, honestly, but it does correlate reasonably well with certain measures like divorce rates and graduation rates and drug abuse and these sorts of things. They're all questions that are designed to just tap whether somebody is somebody who lives for tomorrow or spends a lot of time ruminating about the past. And if they do spend a lot of time ruminating about the past, do they think positively about that past or negatively about that past? Or are they the kind of people who just think only now matters or nothing matters? And those are the dimensions these questions, different questions get at different attitudes, and then you can graph them roughly like this. Here's being negative about the past. Here's being positive about the past. Here's being fatalistic about the past, hedonistic about the present, and future-oriented in some ways. In the middle here is the 50th percentile on all of these. The blue line here is KC. And what I want to point out, let's see, HC is the green line. She's here. And what I really want to point out about KC is that on measures of present hedonism, he's in the first percentile. Right? Not even anywhere towards the mean. And when it comes to fatalism, he's down here in the second percentile. These are his lowest scores. And in fact, it's also the case for, this is DA. DA comes in very low, and nobody is above the mean on this particular score. By the way, these red dots are Zimbardo's idea of the good life. Not much past negativity, lots of positivity about the past, fatalistic present hedonism reasonably high, future orientation reasonably high. But that doesn't mean anything. That's just Zimbardo's idea of what would be healthy and happy and good. But it's not, there's no evidence backing any of that up. What really matters is the 50th percentile and the fact that KC is at floor on these measures. In fact, across all of these people, including developmental amnesics, the dominant temporal perspective tends to be either positivity about their past or future orientation. None of them score highest in hedonism or present fatalism. So not only do they know that there's a past, present, and future, but they have attitudes about it, and the attitudes tend to be relatively positive towards the future. So what I want to say about that is that episodic amnesics don't avow a hedonistic temporal orientation, and they're not notably fatalistic either. But again, you might point out that this is just what they say. What do they actually do in these cases? So here I wanted to look at impulsivity and risk-taking. So you might think that if you're trapped in the permanent present and stimulus-bound only in the here and now, that you would be very impulsive, because the future consequences of eating that cupcake are nothing to you. You can't imagine those future consequences, and you might not so much care about them if now is all you've got. On the other hand, you might think of them as risk-taking people, people who don't care much about the risk that they're undertaking in their day-to-day activities. Sudendorf and Corbalis, for example, in 2007 claimed that this mental time travel capacity gives us knowledge of our own mortality. So if you lost that, well, holy cow, there's no reason not to do this. Right? So is KC impulsive or risk-prone? There's a nice task that's developed for patient populations that dissociates these two phenomena. So impulsivity is operationalized here as the desire to act on the first possible moment for acting. And risk-taking is defined as going for improbable outcomes that have high payoffs. And the way that this test works is there's a computer screen, and it can either begin with 5 cards on the screen or no cards on the screen. In the add condition, it begins with no cards on the screen, and then goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cards. At any point, they can tap the screen, turn over the cards, and if the winning card, which will always be under one of these cards, if the winning card is present when they turn it over, they get a reward, and the reward is inversely proportional to the number of cards that are present on the screen. So you get big payoffs if you turn this one over and that's the winner, and you get very low payouts if you tap the screen here and it turns over and there's a winner. Right? So if you're impulsive, and in the subtract condition, you start with 5 cards and then go 4, 3, 2, 1. So the thought is that if you're impulsive, acting at the first opportunity for acting, then in the subtract condition, you should choose with 5 or 4 cards present. And in the add condition, you should choose with 1 or 2 cards present. But if you're a risk taker, the kind of person who just likes gambling, on low probability but high payout situations, then you would expect that in either situation you would be choosing with very few cards present. And that's represented on this graph. Here's what impulsivity would look like. In the impulsivity would look in the subtract condition, you would choose with many cards. In the add condition, with very few cards. Neither would be no difference between the two. Risk-taking, choosing with only very few cards. And KC doesn't really fit any of those profiles. In fact, if anything, you see a kind of conservative response bias, something in the direction of neither. And in fact, when you test his probabilistic discounting behavior, that is, you ask him to trade you $10 for a 90% chance of $15, or $10 for an 80% chance of $16, and you do this with KC, HC, and DG, there's also DA over here, compared to controls, you see no difference in the extent to which they discount the value of rewards with the probability of receiving that reward. So if they're trapped in the present, they're trapped in the present with knowledge that there's a future and a past and a present, and they're trapped there with attitudes about the past and the future and the present, and they don't seem to behave impulsively, and they don't seem to be fatalistic, and they don't seem to be hedonistic, and they don't seem to be especially risk-taking individuals. So whatever they've lost by having lost their episodic memory, it doesn't seem to be harming them in these domains on these kinds of tasks. But we wanted to look at their intertemporal choice. So suppose that I gave them an opportunity to trade $10 now for $15 next week, or $20 a month from now, or $30 a year from now. We all have a natural tendency, we're all different in this respect, and probably are different from one time to the next in some cases, but we all have a tendency to discount the value of a dollar systematically with time. It's one of the most well-studied behavioral economic paradigms that there is. Now, suppose that you didn't know that there was a future, or you didn't care about the future, or you were trapped in a permanent present. What would your discounting curve look like? Well, one prediction is that they would just discount as steeply as they possibly could. That is, the value of a dollar tomorrow is nothing to me. The value of the dollar today is everything. And that their curve would just go straight into the ground. A second possibility, this requires some setup, is one hypothesis about why we discount the future, which is that we are counting the value of the reward against the pain of waiting for it. So if we anticipate, if we think forward in time and we anticipate, I could have that cake tomorrow, I could have more cake tomorrow than I'm getting now, but then I'll have to wait for the cake. And waiting for the cake is so unpleasant that it reduces the value of the cake in the future because I have to subtract the unpleasantness of waiting for it. These are going to be hard to see from the distance. But again, we've got DA and KC relative to controls, HC relative to controls, and DG relative to controls. And you can probably see it clearest here, 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 and over here, that there's no significant difference between any of these people and controls on their discounting of future rewards. That is, they discount them at exactly the same rate. By the way that we characterize this is we do an area under the curve analysis and then compare the areas under the curve. And again, no significant. The reason that's important is that it's independent of any particular shape. We don't have to decide whether it's hyperbolic or not. We can just calculate the area and deal with it that way. If you ask KC how he's solving these puzzles, he's not very helpful. Can you say how you thought about these decisions? He says, I don't know. Gut reaction? Yeah. What made you decide to take that amount? We asked him at one point. No reason. What would you use it for? No idea. How would you decide which amount to take? Well, I think of what sounds like a better deal. Are you thinking about what you would spend it on? No. Is there anything you would spend it on? No. If you had to guess, what would you do with it? I'd put it in the bank. That's like the classic semantic answer. I would put it in the bank. If we push him really hard, he says he'll spend it on beer. That's his favorite answer if we really keep pushing him on this. But he's not forming any idea of what he's going to do with this money, but nonetheless he's exhibiting a kind of discount of the future. DA, who was an accountant, said that he made strictly economic decisions, accounting for interest rates and inflation. That's how he did the calculations. HC said she tried to estimate how long she'd be able to hold out. She's a very bubbly person. DG said he just did it on gut feeling. But whatever they're reporting about their internal states, their behavior seems indistinguishable from people who have fully intact episodic memory. So what I'd want to say about this, at least with respect to the first prediction, is that episodic amnesics don't always choose the immediate reward. They don't discount more steeply than other people. So it would appear that episodic projection into the future wouldn't be required for one to value future rewards. That's kind of important, actually. In the debates about abortion in philosophy, for example, it's often said that one of the things that justifies abortion is the fact that the fetus is not in a position to imagine a future in which it receives goods. And that makes it not as special as something that does have that imaginative capacity about its future. It doesn't have a future of its own, is the claim. If HC and KC can't imagine the future, that has devastating consequences according to that sort of argument. This seems to suggest that they do have a future, they can think of themselves as having a future, and they invest it with value, that they don't think that the future is valueless. Discounting conclusion number 2, this prediction that they would just flatline and be the same all the way across. Episodic amnesics discount the future despite their inability to imagine the pain of waiting, so it doesn't look like the pain of waiting is responsible for their decision making. I don't know, I'm getting close to the end of time. Is that right? And I want to leave some time for question and answers. Let me just very quick, this is a complicated experiment. It concerns the Allais paradox. The Allais paradox is a kind of decision-making anomaly that we all exhibit, a kind of incoherence in our rational decision-making. Here's how the story goes. If I offer you a choice between $1 million for sure or an 89% chance of $1 million, a 10% chance of $5 million, and a 1% chance of 0. Most people in this situation, I won't take a poll, but most people in this situation will go for option A. Give me the sure $1 million. And they will do that even though the expected utility of the second choice is greater than the expected utility of the first. And asked why, many people will say, well, I imagine with my luck I end up over here in the 1% where it didn't work out in my favor. If I offer you instead a choice of an 11% chance of $1 million versus a 10% chance of $5 million, most people will take the 10% chance of $5 million. What's interesting about this, however, is that if we block out that third column over here, these decisions are identical. The only thing that we've done in that last column is add an equal amount to either side of the decision. And it's a fundamental axiom of decision-making, decision theory, that your preferences shouldn't shift if you add equal amounts to both sides of the choice. But we all do this. A common thought about why we do this is that we anticipate regretting being in the 1% situation. And so people have developed a theory called anticipated regret theory, in which they claim to factor in regrets of the possible future states. And if you factor in those regrets, then you can make it so that this ends up being a rational decision on the part of people, of all of us, who make those kinds of choices. If that's your hypothesis, then people who lack episodic future thought, who can't imagine themselves in that 1% situation, who are trapped in a permanent present, shouldn't be able to anticipate that hot future regretting situation. And so they shouldn't make Allasian choices. In fact, Loomis and Sugden, who invented the anticipated regret hypothesis, make exactly this prediction. They say that some individuals may experience no regret or rejoicing at all. In these special cases of our theory, we would predict that the individual's behavior would conform to all the conventional axioms of expected utility theory. So we put them in a situation where they have to choose between in high probability situations and low probability situations between two options, really just setting up the choice of the Allasian choice situation for them. I don't know if I should walk through all of this or not, but basically in a high probability, somebody who's an Allasian, somebody who makes Allasian choices of this sort, should prefer risky investments more in the low probability cases. So here, they should go for the risk in these sorts of cases, the low probability ones, than in the high probability ones. They should always take the top left there. And if we're looking instead at losses instead of gains, then you should expect the reverse result. And what we found, in fact, is that KC, in the case of gains, prefers the risky choices in the low probability cases to the high probability cases, and among losses that he prefers the risky choices in the high probability cases rather than the low probability cases. In other words, he's a Laysian just like the rest of us. So either we're a Laysian for reasons that have nothing to do with anticipated regret. Prospect theory offers some thoughts about that. Or there are non-episodic means of anticipating regret, like semantic anticipation or some automatic projection system. But the point that I want to make through all of this is that these metaphors that are coming out of cognitive science, that people with episodic amnesia are trapped in a permanent present, are powerfully seductive metaphors. They're extremely devastating in their consequences for the people who have these kinds of impairments. To say that somebody has no concept of the future or is trapped in a permanent present or is stimulus bound is about as devastating a thing as you could say about somebody from an agential perspective. But here's what I think we've shown. If they're trapped in the here and now, in a permanent present, as Sue Corkin says, they're trapped there with knowledge of the past, the present, and the future. They're trapped there with preferences concerning the past, the present, and the future. They're trapped there without being impulsive or prone to risk-taking behaviors as a result of all of this. They're trapped there with the ability to assign value to future events and to make choices that respect the value of future events. And they're trapped there apparently with an ability to expect their own regret at making bad decisions. So it seems that episodic future thought isn't required, or the ability to perform well on episodic memory tasks does not entail that you're somehow unable to conceptualize where you are in time or have a world that's bigger than an instantaneous present. What's happened, I think, in this situation is that the language of the psychological vocabulary of cognitive science has gotten a grip on us. We start describing these people as lacking mental time travel. We describe them that way in part because it's a sexy way of describing people of this sort. It gets attention when you talk about them as having mental time travel difficulties. But that metaphor gets a hold of us, and now we start running with it and we say, oh, they're trapped in a permanent present. But we never even think to ask whether that extension of the metaphor into these new areas requires more evidence. What more evidence did we need than that initial discussion with Endel Tulving, after all? But it turns out that when you go and ask the questions, episodic memory ends up being more puzzling in some ways. It's not a mental time travel device, whatever it is. And I haven't even taken a stance on what episodic memory is, but it's not a mental time travel device, and it's not the sole source of our own subjective awareness of temporality. And it's certainly not the keystone of our agential capacities, because many of those are intact in the absence of the ability to perform well on episodic memory tasks. So the take-home lesson here for me is that the ordinary concept of remembrance is not the scientific concept of episodic memory. Our ordinary understanding of the relationship between episodic memory and other capacities doesn't apply to the scientific sense in many cases. Our intuitive thought that our memories of the past must be somehow related to our sense of our own temporality is an intuition, not a deliverance of fact. Individuals with episodic memory deficits retain much of their sense of time. Now, I don't want to overstate this. People with these sorts of amnesias are severely disabled and have extreme difficulty caring for themselves. It's not surprising that Casey had to live with his parents for the last 30 years. And I wouldn't want to downplay it, the significance of these deficits. But I do think it's really important when we're dealing with people with cognitive impairments that we not treat them with a one-size-fits-all incompetence category, but rather we ask the question, given this particular sort of deficit, what are the consequences of that for their ability to live a full-fledged human life? And that we fully explore those possibilities before we foreclose them with our metaphors. There's a lot that we could do going forward. That's really the end of the talk that I wanted to give today. But let me just say one last thing. If this is at all interesting to you and you care about this kind of stuff and you care about people with memory deficits, Ben Graham, the student that I was mentioning to you earlier who's now at Yale Law School, and I found this old video of a patient who as a result of carbon monoxide poisoning, was claimed to not be able to hold anything in consciousness for longer than 1 second. And we found a film of this patient that's about an hour long, involving an interview with Gustav Störing, who's depicted here in the back. And he explores many of these questions about what could be left in the life of a person who was no longer able to store anything in even short-term memory stores. And so far as we can tell, it's about the most extreme form of a working memory deficit that we've ever seen characterized. So if you're interested in these kind of phenomena, you might check out this article in Cortex. This article is called Remembering Mr. B, and there's a link to the film there. And it will totally be worth the hour of your time that you spend watching it. I guarantee it. All right, that's the end. Thanks.
I'm actually a little bit puzzled that in this whole field, the episodic memory consequences are actually conceptualized in such a temporal way, when already the definition points to an important emotional difference, right? It is about the sort of the hot and the cold of the semantic and the episodic, and it seems a lot of the examples that you give about impulsivity seems to be more a lack of actually caring about memorable emotional future events, thrill-seeking, impulsivity and so on. You're not taking a risk just to make a risk, but because you get an adrenaline rush and then remember it as something positive you can tell other people about, right? And that seems to be a dimension that is much more salient to the question rather than this question of temporality itself.
The only reason that I'm focused, you might want to stay by there because I'm going to ask you to clarify the question. There's no doubt that there's an emotive component to what's going on here. The way that episodic memory was, the reason that I'm discussing it in these terms is just that the literature itself discusses it in terms of time. And so I'm just taking their version of the hypothesis and running with it. Now, why is it that they've focused on that rather than the hot and emotional side? They have also focused on the hot and emotional side. But as far as I can tell, that elaboration of the story in Endel Tulving's hands in 1983 was one piece of like 20 different things that he would list as important about episodic memory. More important were things like the spatial and temporal organization of events. The hot component, I think, was in part brought in to explain the apparent importance of this phenomenon to us. But I'm not sure I'm addressing your question yet. I sense something more in it.
It seemed to me it's more about what role emotions and anticipated emotions and remembered emotions play in regulating behavior rather than questions of orientation in space and time, right? So all the examples that are not following the predictions are actually ones that can be easily understood, at least intuitively for a layperson like myself, as having to do with how they relate to emotional, or don't remember emotional reactions.
I'm not, that's the part that I'm confused of, because I don't see how the emotional story would explain the fact that they're identical to us on all of these measures.
No, it came up in the context of impulsivity, right? If I'm not thinking about the negative consequences of eating cupcakes all the time, right? But of course, I'm not eating cupcakes because it's just good, because it makes me feel good, right? It's a sugar rush and whatever. Or with thrill seeking, it is something that has to do with my emotional future. But if that doesn't work, if that doesn't, in some way it doesn't work, then impulsivity is not a predicted property of this kind of patients.
So in that case, the story would say that the emotional reaction was, what these sorts of studies would show is that those emotional reactions are not required. That the hot emotional reaction, whether we're taking it as about time or about that, it seems that we would still be making the same, maybe not on impulsivity, right, but on anticipated regret, certainly what we're getting out of them is, so suppose that you take away the hotness of the future thought, then what you would expect is that they would collapse into a they would collapse into a straight utility theory sort of response, but that's not what they do.
But maybe my question was just an emotional response to what you said. For us.
Yeah, no.
By the way, there's a reception immediately followed, so stick around.
Thanks for a great talk, Carl. So I wondered how much you might think of the results you have as challenging the idea that episodic memory is a natural kind, rather than thinking of it as challenging the association of episodic memory with temporal experience in other ways.
Yeah, that's a great question. That one I get. I have grave doubts about episodic memory as a natural kind, and the more that I work with this, there's a kind of cognitive neuropsychology is a very strange discipline in many respects. And one aspect of the strangeness is that if you ask me, what is Broca's aphasia? One reasonable answer, as Joseph Bogan once said, is it's what Broca's aphasics do. What's Wernicke's aphasics? Well, it's what Wernicke's aphasics do. What is episodic memory? It's what Casey can't do. And a lot of the evidence that we have for the dissociation and the distinction between these is from these patients. We're helping ourselves to the assumption that, in fact, they've damaged something rather precise, and that it's knocked one thing out and left everything else intact. But it might be that what we're dealing with is really something that's quite messier. My inclination on all of this has been to get much more fundamental. It's clear that what I'm doing is pushing away from the temporal way of thinking about episodic memory and not thinking of it as some sort of device that mentally transports us here and there. To the extent that I want to give it a mentalistic description and even take any sort of positive steps on this, one unifying hypothesis, here's a better way to say it, one unifying hypothesis that comes out of contemporary cognitive science is that we have an event cognition system of some sort. And what that system does is it generates details and binds them together into either actual remembered events or possible events going forward. And my colleague at Washington University, Jeff Zox, is one of the pioneers in this sort of area. And if you come at the system from that angle, you say, like, the brain has to parse events. It's got to parse what happens in the world, and it's got to store those happenings, and it's got to anticipate future happenings of that sort. And if you think of this as really sort of an event processor rather than a time travel device, then maybe what's lost in these patients is not so much the ability to transport themselves in time, but rather the ability to construct rich events of some sort. And then the fact that it's in the past and in the future is not so surprising. You get that for free. But the fact that it's past or future is not the central feature of the phenomenon. So one very natural way to go is to say, like, well, maybe episodic memory so construed as this forward and backward mental time travel device isn't the right way to think of it, but rather we should think of it as an event construction system that's been damaged. And is that push? There's still a natural kind sort of thing that I'm talking about there, but it's a very different natural kind than the one that we started with at the beginning. Yeah. That's right. And in fact, David Rubin and Sharda Umanat out of Duke are just now coming out with a paper in which they claim that the core phenomenon here is a sort of event memory. And that whether that comes with an experience of reliving, whether it's hot or cold, whether it's a whole other traumatic or not, biased towards negative or not, there's a core thing which is something like event memory, and then these different ways of modifying it. So I think part of what really what we're trying to chip away at here is just this one characterization of the thing is essentially time involving, and to move it towards something else, and that something else might be something of this sort.
Thank you, Carl. I would like to wonder if you could reflect on maybe the sociology of this. How does this happen in science? That perhaps a colorful or attractive metaphor becomes incorporated, and then because it was helpful at one point, or maybe the author couldn't constrain themselves, and then becomes part of how people think of that area of science. I'm thinking of elsewhere in my own discipline, the selfish gene, which as a cartoon that has incredible power with all these same kind of consequent problems to it, starting with not popularization. So is it the fact that these cases are so colorful and fantastic that people outside psychology like them, or does it happen in regular science too?
Good. That's a great question. I think it happens. I think it can happen anywhere. And that when we start labeling genes like an obesity gene, or that's exactly the kind of thing that will also grab our attention and focus it in a particular, that it will direct the way that we do research on that gene, to think of it as a gene that's associated with autism, or a gene that's associated with obesity or something like that. And I'm not going to play amateur sociologist and think about what are the mechanisms for meme generation and what keeps them going over long periods of time. In this case, I think it is a sort of colorful metaphor coupled with the very seductive way that we think about memory in our everyday lives. We tend to think of it as this kind of mentally transporting experience. People write about it that way in literature. And so I think that it's partly that we start with, I think it's a particular problem with the cognitive sciences or sciences of the psychology. If we start with our folk psychological categories, the everyday language that we use to talk about one another's thoughts and beliefs and the way that we move around in the world, that has built into it a whole host of assumptions about what drives us to behave in the ways that we do. And the psychological vocabulary is often using exactly the same words to describe different phenomena. But the fact that we're using, part of the way that we sell the project to the public, part of the way that we get funding for the project, part of the way that we tell other people that it's an interesting project, is by associating it with these folk psychological notions. But those folk psychological notions come with a bunch of laws about what memory does for us, and those come along for free into the scientific endeavor. But I don't think it's uniquely in the neurosciences. I think there are places like in biology, elsewhere in biology, where there's an idea that takes hold, and the concept, in a way, the word. My friend Susan Fitzpatrick calls it semantic creep. That you've got some term, and that suddenly the meaning of that term starts broadening out and encompassing more and more things over time. Maybe autism, I mentioned autism already, but there's a phenomenon, right? Autism, 1 in 10,000 in 1980 diagnoses, 1 in 88 today. Now there's a term, and that term is now creeping out and being applied to more and more things, but we're not really sure what's driving, what regiments the application of that term. So I don't think it's just in these sciences. I think it happens in many places. But I think it's something we have to be, that a good scientist needs to very, very much be aware of and on guard against.
It's a very big subject because it also involves the cognitive psychology that Tulving was discovering or creating, which neglects not only the taste of chocolate, but neglects the whole dynamics of human emotion, and which is not accounted for in that field. The great success of that field is that it has identified the parameters, in this case, personal experience versus impersonal experience, which become which are causative parameters. So that the whole subject that Tulving has created, which is a very popular field, should sync with these criticisms. So it isn't just the one particular thing. It's it is this is the present state of the large section of psychology and neuroscience, and so it's not just any particular aspect that is giving it wings. It is that the whole set, that whole system, is polluted by Tulving's discoveries.
That makes this talk a much more significant talk. That's the case.
You tugged at a thread.
Yeah. I think what I'm trying to tug on here is something that could be tugged on in many different areas of cognitive psychology, and I think that there is a lesson about keeping one's hypotheses relatively close to the data that one has collected, and keeping one's constructs fairly well regimented in terms of measures that we can assess. Episodic memory is typically assessed in a kind of autobiographical interview where I give you cues, birthdays, and then you tell me about a birthday party, or I say, vacations, and then you tell me about a vacation that you took. That's one tool for getting at it. There are 30 other tools that one might use to study something like this phenomenon, but regimenting those and telling when we're in fact getting at the right capacities is, I think, a crucial piece of doing cognitive science well, and I think it is something that's often forgotten because we find a favorite technique or a favorite way of reproducing the phenomenon and we stick with that. So yeah, I think as you know, I think there are broader problems than just the episodic memory case. My answer to Chris was much more conservative in wanting to keep the idea that there are cognitive capacities and that they're worth trying to decipher. I could imagine a future neuroscience where that might no longer be the reasonable way to proceed.
One more question, and we'll go to reception.
I was wondering if these these people can be conditioned. Most memories are not. There are a lot of memories that are subconscious, that are repressed, that are displaced, that might be stored in different parts of the brain, for example. So I was wondering if anybody has done any sort of psychoanalytic kinds of studies on these people. Whether, for example, if they've had a phobia in the past, does that phobia disappear? Is it still there? Can you condition them in the future to create a phobia in them, even without the explicit memory?
Yeah, I don't think that I would get the latter experiment by the IRB board. I have, so on the first question, I think that the dominant orientation of contemporary cognitive psychology / neuropsychology is, though occasionally there's lip service to psychoanalysis, considers itself largely separate from that tradition. And so to answer although I spend a lot of time reading Freud and other psychoanalysts, that tradition, for sociological reasons, has not tested those hypotheses. Now, as for conditioning has been tested. I'm not talking about repressed memories or recovery from symptoms that result from repressed memories. But if you just want to know, can they learn to improve their tennis swing, or can they learn to be scared of a doctor with a pin in their hands that keeps sticking them in the hand? The Clapper-Ed test is a common test that's described with and it's actually shown in this video, that somebody with a very severe memory deficit, you want to see whether they can still start becoming hesitant to shake the hand of a doctor who's hiding a pin in it. And KC passes this test, eventually stops shaking the doctor's hand, and when asked why, he says, because sometimes doctors have pins in their hands. Not because you just stuck me, but because sometimes doctors have pins in their hands. So there's something getting in there. It's very semantic, not episodic in nature, but conditioning, different forms of conditioning and cueing are still totally operative in these guys. Now, as for the psychoanalytic questions, I just think that those have not been tested. We have been interested in dreaming, actually, and whether you would get character. It's now thought that sleep is a period of profound memory consolidation, and I would be very interested to know about brain behavior during sleep in somebody who is not remembering anything, and whether you would still see the characteristic changes that you see in people that are thought to be associated with memory consolidation. I think that's the best I can do on that one. Yeah. All right, thank you.